Welcome to the Deep Dive. We're the show where we sift through, stacks of research, articles, and our own notes to really pull out the key insights, giving you a shortcut to being genuinely well-informed. Today, we're tackling something that sounds incredibly simple, almost like a universal law. One has to pay one's debts.
It feels fundamental, doesn't it? Like the bedrock of morality, how things should work.
Exactly. It's something we're taught from day one. But what if that basic truth isn't so true after all? What if it's actually tangled up in history, full of contradictions, and honestly, often tragically false?
It's fascinating because the moment you start digging, just scratching the surface of that simple statement, you find this incredibly complex and, frankly, often unsettling history. It really challenges our assumptions about debt, about money, even about justice itself. It's a journey into how our economic systems evolved and, shaped our deepest moral ideas.
Absolutely. So our mission in this deep dive is to explore that counterintuitive history. We're drawing on a lot of sources, especially David Graeber's big book, Debt, the First 5,000 Years. The goal is to unpack how these ingrained ideas about debt and morality came about, often in really surprising ways, so you get a truly informed perspective on this, fundamental part of society.
And prepare yourself, because some of the insights might really flip your understanding on its head. Like, you probably assume lenders always deserve to get paid back no matter what, right? But the idea that all debts must be repaid come what may isn't even universally true in standard economic theory.
Really? How so?
Well, think about it. Lenders are supposed to accept some risk. If there were no bankruptcy laws, if banks knew they'd get their money back plus interest, no matter how crazy the loan.
They'd have no incentive to be careful.
Exactly. The whole system would encourage completely reckless lending. It would be a disaster.
That makes sense. No downside for the lender. We'll also look into the really grim reality of lending money to, say, dictators.
Who then squirrel it away in Swiss bank accounts.
Right. And meanwhile, the ordinary people in those countries are left holding the bag, often paying back the debt 3 or 4 times over because of interest.
And they're enduring these harsh free market policies, often cooked up in places like Washington or Zurich, policies they never agreed to, which often just don't deliver.
Devastating. And we're also going to tackle the myth of barter. That story you hear in every economics textbook about how money started.
Yeah, the butcher, the baker.
That whole thing. Turns out it's pretty much just a story, a myth. The historical and anthropological evidence just doesn't support it.
Which forces us to totally rethink how human exchange even began.
Okay, so let's unpack that barter myth first. It's kind of the foundation stone for a lot of economic thinking, isn't it? Adam Smith.
Right, Adam Smith in The Wealth of Nations. He talks about this inherent propensity in human nature to truck, barter, and exchange one thing for another. That's the basis of economic life, he argues.
He even uses the example, nobody ever saw a dog make a fair and deliberate exchange of one bone for another. But humans, we're different. We naturally swap, compare, always looking for the best deal.
And he gives those classic examples like savages trading venison for hides, or the famous butcher, brewer, and baker scenario.
Ah, yes, the butcher has meat, the baker needs meat, but the butcher doesn't eat bread right now.
Yeah.
How do they trade?
Exactly. And boom, money is supposedly invented to solve this double coincidence of wants, providing a common measure of value. It's a neat story, almost too neat.
Too neat is right, because here's the kicker. The evidence just isn't there. For centuries, people influenced by Smith explorers, missionaries, administrators went out looking for these barter economies.
They expected to find places where everyday life involved neighbors swapping goods directly, like I'll give you 20 chickens for that cow. They found basically nothing of the sort. Despite finding an incredible variety of economic systems, no one has ever documented a society where that kind of direct barter between neighbors was the main way of doing things.
So the founding myth of economics lacks empirical evidence.
Pretty much. Anthropologists have actually been, complaining about this myth of barter for nearly a century. Their fieldwork constantly contradicts it.
You mentioned Lewis Henry Morgan and the Iroquois?
Yes. His detailed work showed their economy centered on communal longhouses. Goods were pooled and then allocated by women's councils based on need. No trading arrowheads for meat there.
But economists just ignored this.
Largely, yes. The barter story was too compelling, too foundational to their models.
So if barter wasn't the norm between neighbors, when did it happen?
Well, it did happen, but typically between strangers, or even potential enemies. people meeting on frontiers with no ongoing relationship or trust.
Ah, so not your everyday village transactions.
Right. And these interactions often involved a bit of performance, maybe a playful mock aggression, or sometimes just trying to get the better of the other person to trick or bamboozle them.
That makes sense. The English words themselves, truck and barter, apparently used to imply something a bit shady.
Exactly. In several European languages, the equivalent words carried connotations of cunning, even cheating. The takeaway is you barter with people you don't trust or care about long term.
If you do care about someone, a neighbor, a friend, you deal with them differently. You consider their needs, their situation.
Precisely. Even if you swap things, you'd likely frame it as a gift or mutual support, not a cold, calculated exchange based purely on equivalence.
Okay, so if the whole barter to money story is a myth, what actually came before coined money?
This is where it gets really fascinating. The precursors were actually sophisticated credit systems.
Credit systems before money.
Way before coinage, yes. Get this. The earliest written documents we have, Sumerian clay tablets from Mesopotamia dating back to like 3500 BC.
What are they about? Trade deals?
Nope. They're accounting records, credits and debits, lists of rations the temples handed out, records of debts owed for things like rent on temple lands, often specified in measures of grain or silver.
So writing itself seems to emerge alongside debt record keeping.
It certainly looks that way. This detailed tracking of who owed what to whom predates the invention of coins by thousands of years.
Thousands, wow. That really does flip the script.
Yeah.
Money wasn't invented to escape barter.
It seems not. It looks like money emerged from these abstract systems of accounting and credit. Obligations were measured and tracked long before physical tokens became the primary medium of exchange.
So this is the credit theory of money you mentioned.
Exactly. Thinkers like Alfred Mitchell Innes were big proponents. They argued money isn't a physical thing, a commodity, but primarily an accounting tool, an abstract unit of measurement.
Like an hour or a centimeter.
Precisely. You can't touch a dollar in the abstract sense, only the token representing it. And historically, these abstract accounting systems came first.
Even Keynes, John Maynard Keynes, came around to this.
He did. After spending years buried in Mesopotamian banking records, his Babylonian madness, he concluded that looking at the actual history, for the last 4,000 years, money has essentially been a creature of the state. Not some natural market evolution, but an invention tied to political authority.
A creature of the state. That's a strong statement.
And it aligns with the evidence. Think about the word symbol. It comes from the Greek symbolon, which meant a tally.
A tally. Like notches on a stick.
Sort of. Often it was an object, maybe pottery or wood, broken in two. Each party kept half to represent an agreement or, very often, a debt. Our word for an abstract representation comes directly from a physical token recording an obligation.
You said the Chinese word fu has a similar origin.
Almost exactly the same. These weren't about swapping goods. They were about representing abstract agreements, usually debts.
Which directly contradicts that idea of money being just a veil hiding the real barter economy underneath.
Absolutely. Economists like Paul Samuelson talked about stripping away the obscuring layer of money to find the barter beneath.
But history shows the opposite.
Completely. Without money, or at least abstract accounting systems, large-scale barter just doesn't happen. When economies supposedly revert to barter, like in the early Middle Ages,
What actually happened?
they often just stop using physical cash widely, but they continue to value things in terms of the old monetary units. In medieval Europe, people still calculated prices in Roman currency, even when Roman coins were long gone.
So the abstract concept of money persists even without the coin.
Right. Ironically, it's money and the state structures that support it, laws, police, monetary policy, that allow us to think of the economy as this separate sphere of self-interested exchange. Money doesn't just facilitate exchange, it shapes how we even conceive of it.
That's a huge shift in perspective. Money as a social and political construct, not just a tool.
Exactly. And that leads us right into the next big area. The link between debt, morality, and how inequality emerges.
Right. The core question being, what happens when we boil down complex moral obligations into simple, quantifiable debts?
It's a profound question, because debt, unlike, say, gratitude or a favor, can be precisely quantified, a number.
$40,000 at 12% interest.
Exactly. And that precision makes it simple, cold, impersonal, and crucially, transferable. Your obligation isn't necessarily to a specific person anymore.
It doesn't matter who holds the debt, the calculation is the same.
Precisely. You don't need to think about the other person's needs, their situation, their humanity. You just calculate the principal, the interest, the penalties.
And the human consequences, losing a home, ending up in forced labor.
Those become, in the cold logic of debt, mere externalities, side effects of the calculation. It's brutal.
And this idea of debt being a moral failing, it's baked into our language, isn't it?
Deeply. In German, should means both debt and guilt. The debtor is implicitly a kind of criminal, owing a debt to society.
Even in ancient Crete, Plutarch mentioned debtors pretending to snatch money so they could be charged with violence if they defaulted.
Yes. To justify harsher punishment. This history explains why insolvent debtors were often jailed, or worse, in places like early Rome. The idea of the debtor as an offender runs deep.
Even everyday phrases, thank you, comes from think, meaning, I'll remember this.
Right, an obligation of memory. But in Portuguese, obrigado literally means I'm obliged, I am in your debt.
And merci in French comes from mercy.
Yes, symbolically putting yourself in the benefactor's power. And when we say you're welcome or it's nothing.
We're saying, don't worry, I'm not marking this down in the ledger.
Exactly. We're constantly navigating this unspoken calculus of many debts and obligations. I owe you one. No, don't worry about it. It's the fabric of politeness, but it's all based on this underlying notion of debt.
Fascinating. Now, Nietzsche had some pretty extreme ideas about this, didn't he? Linking morality directly to, well, cruelty.
Extremely provocative, yes. Nietzsche argued that our whole sense of morality, of guilt, originated in the relationship between creditor and debtor, specifically in the creditor's right to inflict pain on the debtor who couldn't pay.
He talked about creditors literally cutting off flesh.
He did. He claimed they took pleasure in the humiliation and torture, and that early law codes weren't about compensation for injury, but about specifying how much of the debtor's body the creditor could literally take. An eye for an eye, quite literally, but as payment.
Is there any actual historical evidence for that specific claim?
Graeber is clear. Not a shred of evidence. It's a powerful, maybe disturbing thought experiment about the conceptual link between debt and violence, but not historically accurate in that literal sense.
But Nietzsche extended this idea to our relationship with society itself.
Yes, he suggested we feel indebted to our community for peace and security, and we repay that debt by obeying laws, following customs, even sacrifice to ancestors fits in as they provide ongoing benefits, increasing the debt across generations. The idea of paying your debt to society starts here, in this very visceral, imagined origin.
A dark interpretation. Let's look at actual ancient civilizations. Mesopotamia had these debt jubilees.
Yes, this is amazing. Rulers would periodically declare a clean slate, wipe out consumer debt, release debt slaves, sometimes even return lands. It was often framed as a grand cosmic renewal.
Why? Just out of generosity?
Not entirely. It was a practical measure to prevent social collapse. Widespread debt bondage led to unrest, people fleeing their land, potential peasant revolts. The clean slates restored social balance.
So it was statecraft maintaining stability.
Absolutely. And rulers knew how to use debt, too. We have King Enmetena of Lagash calculating this utterly astronomical debt owed by a rival king for occupied land trillions of liters of barley. Clearly, he understood compound interest and using debt as a political weapon, even to justify war.
And this wasn't unique to Mesopotamia. Greece had debt crises too.
Big time. Around 600 BC, many Greek city-states faced crises where poor farmers fell into debt, lost their land, became serfs, or were even sold abroad as slaves.
Leading to demands for
Clean slates, freedom for debt slaves, land redistribution. It fueled major political upheaval. In Megara, one faction even retroactively outlawed interest-bearing loans and forced creditors to repay past interest. Radical stuff.
and Rome. Similar struggles.
Constant struggles. Early Roman history is full of conflict between the wealthy patricians and the commoner plebeians over debt. It led to the famous secessions of the plebs.
Oh, the commoners just walked out.
Basically, yeah. They'd abandon the city, camp outside, and refuse to fight or work until their demands about debt relief were met. It forced the ruling class to choose.
Choose between what?
Between letting debt turn the free peasantry into bonded laborers for their estates, or preserving that peasantry, which they needed for soldiers to fuel Roman expansion. Often, the plebes had to really force their hand to get protections against debt bondage.
There was that story Livy tells about Caius Publius.
Right, a young man in debt bondage due to an inheritance, brutally beaten by his creditor for refusing sexual advances. His public appearance, showing his wounds, apparently ignited the crowd and led to the abolition of debt bondage in Rome around 326 BC. It shows how personal and degrading debt could become.
And the Bible, the parable of the unmerciful servant, that touches on this too.
Vividly, the king forgives a massive unpayable debt, but the servant then refuses to forgive a tiny debt owed to him. The king's punishment is horrific. Sell the servant, his wife, his children, to repay the debt.
Sold into servitude.
Exactly. Sons and daughters carried off to the homes of repulsive strangers, facing abuse, violence, possibly forever. The parable uses this worst-case scenario of debt bondage as a symbol of ultimate moral failure. Debt wasn't just financial. It was a threat to one's entire existence and family.
It really sounds like these systems were designed to strip people of their social context, their humanity.
That's a key point, and it brings us to the idea of human economies and the often violent process of turning people and relationships into commodities.
Right, because not all interactions are about cold, hard exchange, are they? There's this concept of baseline communism.
Yes, it's the basic human tendency towards mutual aid among people who aren't enemies. The underlying assumption is, from each according to their abilities to each according to their needs, at least when the need is great or the cost is small.
Like asking a stranger for a light or directions.
Exactly. Small acts that build social fabric. In smaller communities, it often goes much further, sharing food, tools, tobacco. It might be almost impossible to refuse a request from someone within your community.
You mentioned the newer in Sudan.
Right. They'd freely share everyday things like grain or tools. If you had extra, it was expected to be shared until it was gone.
But not everything was shared.
No, and that's crucial. Their real wealth was cattle. Cattle were never shared freely. Young men were expected to defend them with their lives. But, importantly, cattle were also never bought or sold. They existed outside that commodity sphere.
Interesting. So some things are just too important to be commodified.
Precisely. And their reluctance to help strangers, like giving directions, stemmed from this idea of a default state of war with outsiders. Sharing food, breaking bread together was a powerful act of creating trust and peace.
Beyond this baseline sharing, you also have hierarchy playing a role, right? Not pure exchange.
Definitely. Think of patron-client relationships. The patron helps the client in need, but only up to a point, not enough to actually erase the inequality between them. It's based on custom, obligation, not a transaction.
Like those medieval Pomeranian peasants paying taxes in herring and cheese.
Yeah, they use their political leverage to pay their dues, calculated in Roman currency, with actual goods, reflecting their specific relationship with their lords, not just a market price. It shows how social power shapes economic interactions.
Now, this idea of social currency seems really important, like the lele in Congo.
Yes, their money, raffia cloth, camwood wasn't just for buying stuff. It was used to mark relationships, seal promises, pay for brides, settle disputes. It mediated social life.
And this led to the concept of life debts.
A really stark example. If someone saved your life, you literally owed them a life. The payment was often turning over a female relative, usually a sister, as a pawn.
A human being as collateral for saving a life.
And this pawnship system became incredibly complex and hereditary. If a woman was a pawn, her children and her daughter's children would be too. Men were constantly juggling these obligations, acquiring, swapping, redeeming pawns. Village life became this intricate game centered on the exchange of rights over women.
How did violence fit into this?
That's the critical link. According to Graeber, it was only when violence entered the picture, like raids to capture women from other communities, that human lives could be directly exchanged for objects.
So the price of a slave was the same as settling a disputed pawn debt.
Exactly. It reveals that turning a human into a commodity, something sellable, requires ripping them out of their social context. A slave is precisely that. Someone stolen, stripped of kin, identity, history.
Socially dead, in a way.
That's how Roman law saw captured soldiers legally dead, their wills executed, wives considered widows. Complete severance. Commodification requires this initial act of social violence.
And this idea gets even darker with the Tiv concept of flesh debt.
Terrifying stuff. It was a belief about witches tricking people into debt, then demanding the victim pledge their own family members one by one to be killed and cannibalized by the witch's coven.
Just a folktale, though.
A horrific folktale, yes, but Graeber argues it was likely a distorted reflection of real violence happening nearby the slave trade and the practice of penyaring.
Penyaring, what's that?
It was common in West Africa. If a creditor couldn't get repaid, they might just raid the debtor's village with armed men and seize anyone or anything, neighbors, children, livestock, and hold them hostage until the debt was settled.
It didn't matter if they seized the actual debtor's property.
Nope. The point was to put social pressure on the whole community to make the debtor pay up. It worked because community ties were strong, but responsibility towards outsiders was weak. A brutal form of debt collection, turning people into leverage.
This all ties into the concept of honor, doesn't it? How does that fit in?
Honor, in this context, is like surplus dignity. It's derived from having power over others, from having stripped their dignity, or knowing you can.
Which explains why it's so fragile, always needing defense.
Exactly. Violent men are obsessed with honor because any perceived slight challenges that surplus dignity and demands a violent response to reaffirm it.
Like in the Homeric world, where team meant both honor and price.
Perfect example. Heroes pursued honor, which materialized as treasure, followers, loot. There was no conflict seen between honor and wealth.
And medieval Ireland had that honor-price system.
A very precise legal system, yes. Everyone had an honor price calculated in bondmaids, kumomo, or cattle, reflecting their exact social rank, even gender. A woman's honor was half her nearest male relatives.
So if a lord acquired a serf,
He literally bought the serf's honor price, paid him in cows. From then on, insulting the serf was insulting the lord, and the lord collected the fines. The lord's honor increased by absorbing the vassals.
there was that example from Wales, the washerwoman.
Striking, isn't it? If someone drew blood from a high-ranking abbot, the fine included money and a female relative of the offender becoming a washerwoman as a disgrace to the kindred, a living memorial to the dishonor and the debt paid. It's about deep social humiliation. And as money and markets became more prevalent, especially in places like Mesopotamia, there was a sudden focus on women's sexual propriety.
Yes, a real tightening of controls. Laws emerged to distinguish respectable women who had to be veiled in public from prostitutes and slaves, who were forbidden from veiling and punished if they did. Veiling became a class marker.
Marriage itself started to look more like a cash transaction for the poor.
Increasingly so. The existence of slaves, people completely commodified, seemed to influence this. In Nusi, the bride price was apparently equal to the price of a slave girl.
And a husband could use his wife and children as collateral for loans.
Legally, yes. If he defaulted, they could be seized as debt pawns. So a man's honor and his creditworthiness became intertwined with his command over his household. Family relationships, ideally about care, became property rights that could be bought or sold, especially for the poor. Ancient Greece shows this clash between aristocratic honor and the rise of commerce really clearly, doesn't it?
Absolutely. Homeric heroes despised trade. Ideally, an honorable man produced everything on his own estate, didn't handle cash. They contrasted their noble gift-giving with the vulgar marketplace.
But money was creeping in, creating a kind of democratization of desire.
Right. Everyone, high or low, wanted the same thing, money. And increasingly, they needed it. The old assumption that everyone had basic necessities started to break down as markets grew. Cash became essential.
And this fueled those debt crises we talked about.
Exactly. It eroded the old hierarchies and safety nets. The story of Nicostratus and Apollodorus is a great illustration.
The poor aristocrat and the rich, nouveau rich neighbor.
Yes. Nicostratus, the aristocrat, needed money but couldn't bear feeling indebted to Apollodorus, whom he saw as his social inferior. So he basically tricked and defrauded him to get the money, leading to violence and lawsuits. Commercial logic totally confused the old codes of honor.
It seems money just threw everything into confusion. Plato picked up on this.
He did. In the Republic, he shows how simple business ethics of debt repayment are inadequate, and even heroic honor doesn't work anymore when commerce and profit motives muddy everything. It points towards needing a radical break to find coherence.
Which kind of sets the stage for the medieval period, right? An age of transcendence, but also virtual money.
Precisely. This is section 4. Unlike the earlier axial age, roughly 800-200 BC, with its big empires and coinage driving philosophical shifts, the Middle Ages saw empires decline and cash economies recede in many areas.
And powerful religious institutions rose up.
Exactly, and here's the paradox. Physical gold and silver largely flowed into these religious institutions, churches, monasteries, temples, hoarded or gilded onto altars.
While everyday trade used.
Increasingly, virtual credit, Tallies, IOUs, letters of credit, eventually checks and paper money in some areas. People still calculated value in old Roman currency units even when coins weren't common. Money became more abstract.
The idea of money as a symbol became really central.
Absolutely. Remember symbolon, the broken tally representing a debt. That concept resonated deeply in an age grappling with abstract ideas, the spiritual versus the material. Money itself became a kind of philosophical puzzle.
And the Islamic world was a major hub for financial innovation then.
Hugely important. For much of the Middle Ages, Islamic civilization was the economic engine, especially in finance. Merchants were highly respected figures, think Sinbad the Sailor. They operated this vast market, often quite independent of governments.
And Islam had a strict ban on usury, interest.
A complete ban on charging any interest on a loan. This fostered a system built heavily on trust handshake deals, promises backed only by personal integrity.
Which led to innovations like the sack, the origin of check.
Exactly. Places like Basra were famous for markets running entirely on checks. Islamic economic thought also emphasized cooperation over pure competition, with scholars urging merchants to give better deals to the poor. A strong ethical component.
How did Christian Europe handle usury? The church was against it too, right?
Very much so. Figures like Saint Basil condemned moneylenders who preyed on the needy. Jesus' teaching to give without expectation of return was the ideal.
But difficult to maintain in practice.
Yes. The compromise that emerged was interesting. Charity, giving to the poor, was reframed. It wasn't just giving, it was like making a loan to God to be repaid with heavenly interest.
Which sounds nice, but
But it actually reinforced inequality. Theologians like Aquinas argued God can't owe anyone anything, so divine grace is a pure gift, dissolving the debt into a hierarchical relationship, not one of equals.
And this led to the complicated and often tragic role of Jewish communities in medieval finance.
Yes, the notorious and often catastrophic situation. Jews were systematically excluded from most other professions in many parts of Europe. Christian rulers often encouraged them to become moneylenders under royal protection, allowing them to charge high interest backed by state power.
But they weren't really protected.
Not consistently, rulers would periodically turn on them, demand huge sums, torture them, use them as scapegoats. King John pulling Abraham of Bristol's teeth is a grim example. It created these isolated, terrorized communities exploited by the powers that be.
And the church kept tightening usury laws.
They did. They closed loopholes, made usury a mortal sin. But this also spurred financial creativity, finding ways around the rules, like dry exchange, using offsetting bills of exchange to hide interest. Commercial loans became possible at lower rates, but predatory consumer lending often persisted.
It's in this climate of abstract money and complex debts that the Holy Grail legends emerge.
Graeber makes that connection, yeah. Unlike earlier heroes seeking tangible gold, Arthurian knights chase the Grail, something abstract, invisible, maybe intangible, but of infinite value. Perhaps, as one scholar suggested, a kind of ultimate blank check.
Reflecting the shift to virtual money.
It seems plausible. Even the chivalric tournaments had a financial side. Victors held losers for ransom, forcing them into debt, often to merchants who financed the events. The age of transcendence was deeply entangled with the abstractions and realities of debt.
A fascinating blend of the spiritual and the financial. But this medieval world eventually gives way to something else entirely.
It does. It sets the stage for the birth of capitalism, empire, and what we can call the modern debt trap, Section 5.
Starting with the price revolution.
Right. Around 1500, 1650, Europe is flooded with gold and silver from the Americas. This causes massive inflation, prices shoot up, maybe 500% in England.
But wages didn't keep pace.
Not even close. Real wages plummeted, maybe by 60% over 5 generations. Ordinary people were crushed, even melting down family silver to pay taxes, despite all the new bullion flowing in.
And how is this silver extracted?
Through brutal exploitation, mass enslavement, and forced labor of indigenous populations in the mines of Mexico and Peru. Millions died from the work itself and from European diseases. Foundational violence fueling European wealth.
And debt played a role here too, debt peonage.
A systematic policy. Colonists imposed heavy taxes, lent money to those who couldn't pay, then demanded repayment through labor, often trapping people and their descendants for generations.
Weren't there attempts to stop this?
Royal decrees tried, arguing the natives were now Christian subjects, but they were mostly ignored. Financial needs, including the Emperor Charles V's own debts to bankers funding the conquest, took precedence. Indentured servitude worked similarly, binding workers through advance payments.
This period reveals that dual character of capitalism, the adventurer and the financier.
Exactly. You have the daring risk-taker like Cortez pawning his wife's jewels for expeditions, and behind them, the careful financiers, the Genoese bankers, focused on steady, mathematical profit growth, adventure backed by calculation.
And the Genoese invented war by subscription.
A chilling innovation. Investors bought shares in military expeditions, getting a percentage of the loot. The same ships carrying soldiers one day might carry spices the next. War and commerce became directly financially linked.
So violence and finance, intertwined from the start, then comes paper money and bubbles.
Yes. New kinds of virtual money emerged, checks, bonds, stocks, but critically, much of it was based on government debt. Bonds issued by governments, rentas, juros, annuities became the new credit money.
And this fueled the price revolution that pushed people into wage labor.
That's the argument. It wasn't just American silver. It was the multiplication of credit based on state debt that reshaped the economy. Even in Seville, where the treasure fleets arrived, the bullion mostly went straight to bankers to back complex credit schemes, multiplying its value many times over.
Leading to speculative bubbles, like the Dutch tulips.
The tulip mania in 1637, yes. Then the huge South Sea bubble in London in 1720, and John Law's Banque Royale collapse in France in 1721. Spectacular booms and busts fueled by financial speculation seemingly unmoored from reality, often followed by crackdowns, attempts to ban paper money or new companies.
Which feeds into that persistent idea. Bankers are playing God, making money from nothing.
Right. That quote, attributed to Lord Stamp about banking being sleight of hand, captures a popular sentiment. But Graeber argues the deeper scandal wasn't just the creation of money, but the validation of pure greed and unlimited profit as legitimate goals.
Why was that the deeper problem?
Because if unlimited self-interest is the only driver, what ensures loyalty? Even loyalty to the system itself, it creates the Hobbesian problem. If everyone's just out for themselves, why not plunder? Especially when the state itself, the supposed guarantor of order, is issuing the debt that fuels the speculation.
A fundamental tension. And this connects to modern debt imperialism.
Directly. Think about the post-WWII order, leading into the 1980s and beyond. The U.S. runs up huge debts, largely military spending.
But insists other countries, especially in the global south, strictly repay their debts.
Exactly. Often under harsh austerity conditions imposed by institutions like the IMF, and U.S. debt itself is largely bought by banks in countries effectively under U.S. military protection: Japan, South Korea, Taiwan.
And the dollar's role in oil markets.
Crucial. Since 1971, oil is traded exclusively in dollars. Attempts by countries like Iraq or Iran to switch to the euro were arguably followed by U.S. military intervention. It suggests the global financial system rests ultimately on military power or terror, as Graeber puts it.
And the IMF acts like a global enforcer for creditors.
Effectively, yes. Described as the first genuinely global administrative system designed to enforce creditor rights, sometimes through policies that have devastating human costs, like cutting food programs to service debts owed to, say, former dictators.
Before this, though, there was that post-war settlement, a sort of deal with the working class.
Right. Roughly 1945, 1975 in the North Atlantic countries. The tacit deal was give up radical change, and you get stability, unions, social benefits, pensions, healthcare, and rising wages tied to productivity. Your kids might even move up the ladder via education. This created the consumer society.
But that deal frayed from the late 70s onward.
It fundamentally changed. Wages stagnated relative to productivity, but workers were encouraged to buy a piece of capitalism instead. Through debt, 401k, playing the market, but mostly borrowing. Owning a home became central. Thatcher, Reagan. Then endless mortgage refinancing, treating houses like ATMs, and of course, credit cards everywhere. Personal debt exploded.
So buying into the system became synonymous with going into debt.
Pretty much. And it blurred into something resembling old-fashioned loan sharking, especially after the U.S. eliminated federal usury laws in 1980.
Making predatory interest rates legal.
Exactly. Rates of 25%, 50%, even thousands of percent for payday loans became legally enforceable, not by thugs, but by courts, police, bailiffs. The state essentially institutionalized predatory lending.
Which brings us to the final section. How do we reframe our relationship with all this?
A crucial question. And one observation Graeber makes is that even within this debt-heavy system, ordinary people, including those previously excluded from credit, show this stubborn insistence on continuing to love one another.
Meaning?
They still strive to buy homes, throw parties, give gifts, hold weddings and funerals, fulfilling social obligations, even if it means risking default. It's like they're saying, if banks can create money from nothing, why can't we to maintain our communities?
But the system often treats this sociality as irresponsible, even criminal.
That's the disturbing implication. Like those NGO students in Cairo striking for loans but assuming everyone else was corruptly exploiting the system. Long-standing relations of trust get criminalized when the logic of profit and credit bureaucracy takes over.
So we need to move beyond our usual ways of thinking. Jettison old categories.
That's the argument, especially the false choice between state and market that dominates political debate. It limits our imagination, becomes dead weight.
And we need to remember the violence it took to make us think life is just about calculated exchange.
Yes. Remember, debt's key feature is its calculability, demanding equivalence. And historically, treating humans as equivalent commodities often required forcibly severing them from their context through slavery, war, social breakdown.
We're at a strange point now, historically.
Very strange. The 2008 crisis showed that capitalism struggles when people believe it's permanent, because that belief can lead to generating infinite credit. Yet, despite crises, the basic structures remain. And just when it's clear, things aren't sustainable.
Our collective imagination seems stuck.
We struggle to envision genuinely different alternatives.
So what's the takeaway? Are we doomed to repeat cycles?
Not necessarily. Graeber suggests we might be at the start of a major historical shift, maybe comparable to the shift from bullion to credit economies in the early Middle Ages. That transition involved the collapse of empires, major disruption.
Could this time be different?
It's still largely up to us to determine how it's going to turn out. Can we consciously design a transition away from empire and military spending towards structures that limit creditor power and prioritize human well-being? That's the challenge.
So this whole deep dive, it really forces you to question the naturalness of debt and money.
Absolutely. They're historical constructs, born from specific power dynamics, often violent ones. Understanding the myth of barter, the reality of early credit systems, the social nature of economies, it gives you critical tools to see the present differently.
It changes how you hear that phrase, pay your debts. You start asking, what are these debts, really? Who benefits? How are they created?
Exactly. It's about critical awareness of the systems we live in.
So a final thought to leave our listeners with.
Maybe this. Graeber asks us to consider if our real guilt isn't financial, but rather the presumption in thinking of ourselves as being in any sense an equivalent to everything else that exists, so as to be able to conceive of such a debt in the first place.
Meaning, can we truly owe a quantifiable debt to the universe, or even to each other in the deepest sense?
Right. If you can't bargain with the gods or the universe because they encompass everything, including you, then perhaps our most profound obligations aren't debts at all. They can't be calculated or repaid in that way.
What if our fundamental connections are based on something other than debt?
How might recognizing that reshape our future? Moving away from seeing relationships as burdens of debt and towards seeing our interconnectedness as a source of potential, of mutual responsibility, maybe even liberation.
Definitely something to think about. Join us next time on The Deep Dive.